This is High School Not So Much a Musical, a podcast that takes you on a ride through the peaks and valleys of a high school journey. Here are your presenters, Nitin Jaladanki and Ayush Agarwal.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to High School Not So Much a Musical. Today, we are joined with Kevin McShan, who is a journalist who has been diagnosed with cerebral palsy. However, he hasn't let that get in his way. Mr. McShan, if you could talk a little bit about yourself, your podcast that you have, let's have this conversation, and maybe your history with cerebral palsy. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, no problem. First and foremost, I want to thank the three of you for having me this afternoon. It's most appreciated. My name is Kevin McShan. I'm 32 years old. I was born with what's called spastic quadriplegia, cerebral palsy. It simply means that I don't have enough oxygen in my legs to walk normally, and it affects things such as my muscle memory, muscle movement, and muscle dexterity. I host a podcast called Let's Have This Conversation, where I tackle all angles of the news cycle in hopes of giving my listeners and viewers an objective and non-biased look at the way the news and other societal issues affect our everyday life. My history with cerebral palsy, obviously I was born with it, so I've dealt with it all my life, but what I always tell myself is that I have refused to allow my disability to determine the way in which I live my life. We're all given a set of circumstances, and I've chosen to make my circumstances work for me instead of working for my circumstances. I live my life through the notion that inclusion is the gateway to independence, and that's sort of my overriding life philosophy and how I live my life.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so for the listeners that are listening who might not know what cerebral palsy is, could you quickly talk about what it is and maybe what problems it's caused for you throughout your life?
Yeah, so the form of cerebral palsy that I have is called spastic quadriplegia. It affects my muscle memory, muscle movement, and muscle dexterity. It affects my endurance and how long I'm allowed to stand. If I don't use my muscles on a regular basis, they become very spastic and stiff. So stretching and swimming and walking are ways that I deal with the disability that I have. I try to be an example to follow in terms of in terms of living by the notion that I'm always active and always trying to be one step ahead of my disability, if that makes sense, in terms of valuing my fitness and making it a top priority in my life.
So you were born with this. So what have you done in the past to overcome with this? Because I see in your profile picture, you're in a wheelchair of some sort. So could you explain that or what you've done?
Yeah, so no problem. So I, the sort of cerebral palsy that I have doesn't require me, doesn't allow me to have long spurts of endurance. The reason I use a wheelchair is to get around. I can walk with the assistance of a walker, but I use a wheelchair because just to manage my disability in the way that I get around and be mobile and like I said, I try to also be as physically active as I can, because if I don't use my muscles, they become spastic, and it's important for me to keep moving for sure.
Yeah, and I think that applies to pretty much everyone. In fact, yesterday, we did a podcast with the world's strongest bodybuilder about the importance of health and fitness, even for a high school student who's so busy with standardized testing and academics and extracurriculars, because like moving your body and getting adequate amounts of physical exercise can allow you to also improve your mental clarity and just improve overall body performance. So what's the difference between, somebody with cerebral palsy and somebody without it, in terms of what happens if they have a period where they're not doing much physical exercise? Because as you mentioned, like your muscles might spaz up if you don't do much physical exercise. But I also know of people like who don't do much exercise, so even if they do the slightest bit of exercise, like running or something, then they'll get like super bad calf cramps or something, for example. So is there a particular difference between the muscle spasms that you get if you have cerebral palsy versus if you don't?
Yeah, in terms of the different muscle spasms, I think in general, certainly with the pandemic, it's important for all of us to keep moving. There isn't any specific difference between spasms if you exercise or if you don't. I think regardless of disability, that it is incumbent upon all of us to take ownership and make our own physical health a priority, for sure. For me, certainly, if I don't use my muscles over a prolonged period of time, I become very stiff and robotic, and in terms of the movement of my muscles, and it does affect my physical health as well as my mental health. Exercise is also a great release for mental energy, and what I mean by that is it allows you to really hone in and zero in on your mental health as well, because you're physically active and moving and keeping your mind sharp and to the point where you have a sense of focus, where your physical and mental health also benefits as one. So I think it's critically important for anyone to value exercise, for sure.
Okay, so thank you so much for that introduction onto cerebral palsy. So now that we've learned about your problem and how it's affected your life, I want to shift towards how it's affected your life. So what types of discrimination have you faced due to being different from like what society considers like normal? Because like in the end, we're just like all of us. You just have a problem that affects you in a different way. So could you please talk about like different types of discrimination that you faced?
Well, I think when you talk about barriers to access, and that's what I like to coin it as, I think the first thing you look at is, for me anyway, access to employment. It took me 6 years out of college to get my first paying job, part of my professional life has been assisting those with disabilities to find and maintain employment. And one of the reasons I wanted to start the podcast was, the pandemic has hit, and I was just about to start a contract for a company, and then they said because of COVID, my contract was suspended. So I think the first thing you look at is employment equality, which I've worked hard to alleviate and eradicate during my professional life. The second thing, I think when you look at barriers to access for individuals with disabilities, has to do with social isolation and social inclusion, in terms of including individuals with disabilities into societal life, in terms of socially, economically, and spiritually as well. I think folks with disabilities have to work harder, certainly, to get employed, and also to get noticed from a social perspective on some accounts. Most of the people with disabilities, they have to always solve problems and come up with solutions to different areas of their lives. So I think for me, when you talk about barriers to access, I look at two things. Like I said, the employment access and access to opportunity, and creating an environment of social acceptance for individuals with disabilities as well.
Yeah, thanks. So on that note, you mentioned that like you have an extensive history and you went in depth into promoting like employment equality for individuals with disabilities. And in your bio, you said it was with the YMCA of Windsor, Essex County. Like, I'm not sure what that is. So like, could you like maybe explain what that whole situation was and what that like company does?
Yeah, so I'll back up just a little bit. Before I was the job developer at the YMCA, and I'll explain what that was. I was also the regional ambassador for something called the Discoverability Network here in Windsor and Essex County, which was the province of Ontario's new online job matching portal for individuals with disabilities and employers to get connected. So when I worked on the network, I refer to it as the eHarmony of dating. The only difference was instead of going onto the website for dating, you would go on this website and you would create a profile and you would get matched with either an individual with a disability if you were an employer looking to hire, or it worked the opposite way. As a job seeker, you would be matched with employers. And through that work, I was able to get a total of, I was the regional ambassador for about 11 months. And in that time, we were able to get a total of 70 individuals, either a job placement or an internship. And through that work, I was given the opportunity to serve 9 months as the job developer and enhanced employer support facilitator at the YMCA here in Windsor and Essex County. And my role was to help youth and others with disabilities to find, maintain, and locate employment. So that was basically my role. Before any of those two roles, I also served as a program development facilitator for a project called We Are Able, and the intention of the project was to educate employers about the positive benefits of hiring folks with disabilities. And through that effort, we gave 30 community presentations, and we were able to give 28 people employment. So that's just a little bit about my background.
That's great to hear. One thing, if you could talk about, is why do people with disabilities have so many barriers in getting access to employment? Because I know that people, like, everyone has their own like special skill that they're obviously very good at. That's why not everyone is good at everything. Everyone picks a field to specialize in college. They get really, really good at that, and that's how they contribute to society. And since everyone contributes to like a different field of specialization, you end up having a well-rounded society as opposed to like one well-rounded person. So people with disabilities are no different, right? They also specialize in the fields that they are good at. So why are the barriers to employment for people with disabilities?
Well, I think a couple of things. I think there are a lack of education amongst employers about the positive benefits of hiring people with disabilities. You know, we did a study when I worked at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, which found that 80% of accommodations for folks with disabilities don't cost anything at all, and those that do cost less than $500 and can be it could be as simple as the raised height of a desk, the use of assisted software or headsets. So I think there are a couple of reasons. Lack of education is one, and moreover, I think we have to get better at providing opportunities for innovation for employers to rethink the way that they go about the hiring process. Some of people with disabilities are some of the smartest people that you'll encounter. So I think changing the way you hire people is important. Sometimes it's important to fit a person for a job instead of fitting a job to a person instead of fitting a person to a job. And I think the way in which we examine the way we hire people and the way we implement our workforce, because when we look at it, when you hire people with disabilities, your retention costs for new employees goes down, your turnover is lower, and they stay longer because they want to prove that they can do the job. So I think a couple of things we've got to get better at educating employers about the benefits of hiring, and we also have to do a better job at fostering an environment of inclusion and acceptance, which then leads to a better understanding of the way innovation can work to your advantage as an employer, and that way. And by the way, it also increases morale for your entire workforce. So you get increased productivity and decreased turnover and increased morale. So hiring people with disabilities is not only the right thing to do, it's also a smart business decision as well.
So we've obviously talked about the many problems that you faced with cerebral palsy. So has there been any particular role model or person in your life who has helped guide you and has supported you the most?
I'm a big family person, so I have an identical twin brother. We were both born with cerebral palsy. My brother grew out of his, and it still affects things like his handwriting. So obviously, I have a brother and two sisters. I'm grateful to my inner circle, and obviously my parents have played a major role in my upbringing. But if you're looking for professional influences, I'm good friends with the voice of the Detroit Lions, who I met in college, and he shared with me that his mother also had multiple sclerosis, and I interviewed the voice of the Lions. His name's Dan Miller, and I interviewed him for a college assignment, and at the end of it, he said if I ever needed anything, it would only be an email away. So I look at Dan Miller as one of my professional role models. I went to school to become a sports reporter, so Dan's obviously someone that I look up to a great deal. And the great thing about hosting a podcast is I get to meet a lot of influential people, and certainly I've gained some mentors and role models that way. And another person that I have to thank for my professional view on life is my middle school principal. I'll share a story with you guys. 1998 was the last time that I had surgery for my condition on my legs, and I had to go back to school, and the doctor had called my parents and I into a conference room, and he had told my parents and I that I probably would never be able to walk without assistance. And my middle school principal, her name was Dr. Carol Crewley, and she had called me into her office, and she had saw that that news after I had come back from the doctor had really affected me. And she told me that that I would be able to accomplish anything that I wanted to, and the scope of my imagination would only be limited by what I put on myself personally in terms of limitations. So I have to thank her. Certainly Dan has been a great role model and friend. Certainly I've met a lot of interesting people, and one of my other role models, his name is Ryan Peebles. Ryan is the general manager of the student advisory council over at St. Clair College, which was the institution that I graduated from. And Ryan he's also spent over 20 years as a personal support worker, or PSW himself. And when I was done school, I would often have to wait for accessible transportation to pick me up from school, because I don't drive, and I relied on transportation to get to and from school. And the one thing about Ryan, so when I went to school, it was in the basement of an old conference or event center in downtown Windsor, and Ryan's office was directly across the hall from all of my journalism classrooms. And Ryan had made it a point whenever he was on campus to keep his office light on for me if I needed to talk through a problem I was having at school, or just wanted a piece of advice. So if you are looking for a professional role models, I would say Dan Miller, Ryan Peebles is certainly one, and those are the people that I look up to most in terms of professional role models. And certainly my family has played a big role in my personal and professional success as well.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of High School Not So Much a Musical. You just learned about the life story of Kevin McShan, who's a journalist born with cerebral palsy at birth. However, he hasn't let that stop him, as he strives to increase diversity and inclusion in the world towards people with disabilities. Stay tuned for part 2 of our conversation with Kevin, and we'll see you next time. That's our show for today. Now roll the credits. High School Not So Much a Musical is hosted by Ayush Agarwal, Nitin Jaladanki, and Rishi Sinha. Narration by Samhit Padala. Music from Louis Luang Relaxation Cafe, Tune Pocket, and Infraction. If you like the show, please recommend it to your friends and family. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.